week, we're going to be looking at political parties and interest groups and kind of staying within the area of elections. And it really does help to ask the question, who holds political power? So each election is either one of these three groups for the most part, parties, interest groups, or candidates. And which one it is kind of depends on the election year, right? If you have candidates who are very charismatic, the candidates may be the ones who's kind of taking the spotlight. Parties historically have been, and if you look at other countries, parties are generally the driving political power force, but interest groups are really the up and coming areas of increasing political power in the United States, which we'll talk more about at the end. Parties, kind of looking at what they do, the two-party system, political ideologies, which you'll be analyzing for your discussion this week, the party organization, looking a little bit at the history of parties, and then political machines. I mean, if you're planning on running for office, a political party headquarters is probably where you want to go to get started. So they help recruit candidates. They will help candidates with the how-tos of getting your name on the ballot and everything else that you need to do. They help coordinate between elected officials, right? So kind of keeping the parties in stream and going it. And they help kind of establish a relatively shared political agenda. So if you think of the Democratic or Republican parties, or two major parties, you generally have, a relatively shared idea of what each side kind of leans to. And of course, we're going to challenge that notion a bit in our discussions. I do think with the candidates, as far as recruiting candidates, I think two interesting stories, as I have kind of highlighted in the pictures there. Bill Clinton was the keynote speaker at the Democratic Convention in 1988, and then became the presidential nominee in 1992. And Barack Obama as well was the keynote speaker at the presidential convention in 2004, and then became the presidential nominee in 2008. So again, a good example of how political parties are sort of put one of their rising stars, right, to the forefront. And a great place to do that is as the keynote speaker at the party convention. Side, they also help link citizens to the government by providing access to government services. So again, if you are in need of help or assistance in getting a government service and you're registered for a political party, you can often go to them to get some of that help. They will mobilize voters, including often driving voters to the polls. And then of course the big one we'll talk about at the end, and you'll be looking at a little bit this week, raising money, right? So the political parties spend a lot of time and effort raising money and helping choosing which candidates they're going to donate that money to. So we have essentially have a two-party system, right? We have 30 parties here or there. And the reason for that is really this because of two things. The Electoral College is the way it's designed. Basically, it has a winner-take-all approach, as well as most primaries as well within states and localities. So the states can set up some different ways of setting things up, but for the most part, we've used the winner takes all approach to our voting. And in that system, you really need to get a majority. Therefore, you end up with the two candidates. And again, we've turned that into a party or a primary system, which has sort of even further heightened that. Our primary system has not been around as long as probably most people realize. But primaries, originally parties would pick their candidates, and then it became allowing the people to actually choose the candidates through the primary system. But in so doing, we've actually ingrained our two-party system, and specifically our Democratic and Republican parties, as most states now have the Democratic and Republican parties in either their legislation about their elections and how elections are set up, and a few even have it in their state constitutions. That doesn't mean we don't end up with third parties. So we do have a few that sort of linger and stay around, but most of them often form around one issue. And then if that issue does well or is picked up by the public, then that issue will then be absorbed by one of the two major parties. Or in the case of the legalization of marijuana, it was originally picked up by the Democratic Party and their platform, and now it's really kind of absorbed into both parties to some extent. It's really not a party versus party sort of issue. It's more of a state versus state kind of idea. And then I've highlighted the one on the left mostly because I find it interesting that it is kind of hopefully what it looks like. It's a pirate party. So that's a party that's both found in the US to some extent, and it's actually international. It's fairly small, but they're about the open source of information. So, right, keeping information free and open and kind of against copyrights and those types of things. Four's video as well, and you're going to look at this in the discussion this week, but just kind of keeping in mind this idea that party labels versus ideology are not the same thing. So the party name can bring to mind some ideas of what a party stands for, but they're just rough approximations. You can have liberal Republicans and you can have conservative Democrats. And of course, there's a wide range of people within each party and where they stand. And as we talked about in week one, right, the cultures of this different states can make variations as well within the parties within each state. So states have variations from one state to the other, and then even within states, and Illinois is a great example, we have quite a variation between northern Illinois versus southern Illinois, and even then central Illinois having its own characteristics as well. Strongly encourage that you watch the video and the link here. So the slides are posted in ReggieNet, and you can get to this video. It gives a really good historical perspective on political parties, how the parties started, where they've gone, and sort of how they've changed. And I think it really helps with the realignment, de-alignment, and that sort of idea, and shows kind of where that's taken place. And one of the biggest examples is this maps. These are the closest ones I could find to the ones in the video, from 1896 to 2008. And you can see where the states basically have sort of switched, right? The Republicans and Democratic states have essentially almost exactly flip-flopped between over that little over 100 years. And so parties shift, they change, they adapt. And again, kind of going back to the idea, especially now that we have the Republican and Democratic parties coded into a lot of laws with the primaries, and how primaries are set up in each state. They basically usually list those two parties. There's not a great chance that they're going to go away, but there is a really good chance that they will adjust and change. And again, we've seen that, right? We've seen the parties adjust and change, take different political stances. And so a party today versus 20 years ago versus 50 years ago versus 100 years ago is not the same party, right? There's a lot of differences, a lot of changes that take place over time. A little bit, but regulation of the parties and as well as elections is done at the state level. So states decide their election rules, when polls open, when polls close, how many polls are available, what are the requirements for voting within the state. So states really set those rules, and within that also means that they regulate the parties. So parties are regulated at the state level. Party systems really are bottom up. They're not top down. We often talk about the national Republican or national Democratic parties, but those are really just made up of a lot of individual state or even more local parties. So parties really are built from the ground up rather than from the top down. Different than if you look at a lot of other countries, especially European countries, where you have a lot of top down sort of parties. The US party system is not. It's a bottom-up, not a top-down approach. Had strong parties, they've basically essentially been tied to corruption for the most part. So the idea of strong arming of political parties, we saw this often in the early 1900s when we had huge waves of immigrants that came in, especially into New York, and basically the parties would come in and say, hey, you want help with this or you need help with that, and well, that's fine. They would help them out, and then they'd come back and say, hey, remember when I helped you out? Or if you need help with this, then hey, I've got a friend who's running for election and we could use your vote. So there's a few videos on here if you're kind of interested in this idea. So the top one kind of talks about that whole idea of the early immigrants coming in and that sort of, I helped you, you're going to help me sort of mentality. And then the idea of the Chicago way, right? We're from Illinois, so we're familiar with that. So a few videos on that, looking about the Chicago way. Mayor Daley, again, who had that sort of strong personality, strong arming type of political parties. Madigan rules, so something we're all a little bit more familiar with Speaker Madigan, and sort of, again, that idea of the strong arming of a political party within the Democratic Party in Illinois has been that. So, for example, there was a time in Chicago that if you weren't registered as a Democrat, you wouldn't get your garbage picked up, right? So you had to be registered as a Democrat, as part of the Democratic Party, because they ran the city in order to get the services within the city. And so that's the type of things we saw whenever we've had our strong parties within the U.S. So now we'll kind of shift gears to interest groups, looking at why they form, different types of interest groups, some of the strategies and tactics they use, as well as how they're sort of gaining success or becoming the up-and-coming group within election influence. So the first question we start with is, why do they exist? If you think of interest groups or bring interest groups up, oftentimes, right, there's a lot of negative connotation around them, and it's sort of the idea of, why do they exist? And yet it's hard to imagine a political system where they don't. Because the tongue-in-cheek answer kind of is, right? How else is government supposed to know what the voters want? Unless they form interest groups and tell their representatives what they want. Because you're looking at a whole group, right? A group of people who are going to vote cohesively for or against specific policies. This works well when each side is balanced. And in fact, you think of different policy areas where not a lot of legislation gets passed on it, particularly at the national level. It's often because both sides are fairly equally represented. It doesn't work as well when one side is overrepresented versus the other, or when you have an interest that's completely sort of ignored, which is what this cartoon sort of demonstrates, right? On the right, you have Save the Doctors. On the left, you have Save the Lawyers, and no one really representing the patients because they're not really a cohesive group that's easy to come together and form an interest group. And those are the types of groups that often get left out or ignored because they just don't have the time or the ability to form a group. Basically, the problem is just that some interests never get formed, and so they never get represented because interest groups do favor those who already have access, specifically those who have time and money to form and create interest groups. So I do want to highlight the AARP because there's one other big key factor involved in interest groups, and that is having a large consistent voting block. And so the AARP is probably the most influential interest group out there because they have a large group. It's a very large interest with a lot of individuals in it. But more importantly, the individuals that make up their interest group also consistently go to the polls and vote. And therefore, they can tell representatives if you vote for or against if you vote against our interests, so either for or against a policy, our members are going to come out and vote against you. And again, they can basically back that up because their members do go to the poll and they will vote based on what the AARP tells them. All right, so looking at types of interest groups, there's different ways they can be broken up, but I think this is the most sort of beneficial to think about. So most interest groups, about 80% of them are economic. That means that they're out for some sort of benefit to their members, right? Their purpose is to get a benefit, some sort of economical benefit for their members. That's why the members are choosing to be part of their interest. A much smaller percentage of our interest groups are citizen or public advocacy, which is kind of using that purposive incentive or kind of thinking of that greater good, right? Groups that form in order for the greater good, not necessarily for an individual incentive. To sort of our last slide, there's a lot more slides out there specifically on what we're going to be talking about here, which is what interest groups do. They obviously lobby for specific or against specific policies. They're often the ones writing the policies or bills that get passed, right? So they're the experts on their area. So they're often the ones writing the bills. And this idea is kind of known as an either issue network or an iron triangle. Issue network seen as a more positive sort of collaboration between interest groups, bureaucrats, and legislatures. And then the iron triangle is sort of a more negative view, right? That it's just these three groups that have influence over policy and no one else is part of it. So again, you can kind of take either approach, right? Is it collaborative or is it, kind of getting everyone working together to sort of get what's best for everyone, or is it sort of this iron triangle and the regular everyday citizens are sort of left out? And then they spend a lot of their time fundraising, and this is where their influence is really increasing. So bundling, super PACs, doing fundraising events. You're going to look at these more closely, and you'll see on the slides that I posted, I have a number of slides giving some additional information on this, and you'll be looking at this for your end of the week assignment as well. And then the last thing they do, and this has come up right recently as well, is lawsuits. So oftentimes interest groups will use lawsuits in order to sort of get their policies in place through the judicial branch as opposed to through the legislative branch. So interest groups, again, are sort of coming up and coming. They often work with political parties or tied to political parties, sort of working in tangent. And then the really big key thing to keep in mind here, and that I really want you to kind of look at is the fundraising. So with political parties, you're going to be focusing on sort of the nuances, the fact that they're not as cohesive as they seem. And then with interest groups, it's sort of looking at that money and the influence that they have because of the money.